So let's talk inflation. Let's dive right into the issue of the day. There's a healthy debate in economic circles today about whether the high inflation that we're experiencing is the result of supply shocks that haven't yet unraveled, or too much emergency COVID spending, or profit taking by big corporations, or maybe all of the above. What do you think, and why is it important to get that diagnosis correct?
For a while, I thought, well, it's not so important how we got here. We need to get inflation down. We have to, but actually, that's not true. And as I've thought more about the inflation debate, I understand how you really need to know how we got here to have good advice on how to get to a better place.
Right, right.
There has been a lot of discussion that the high inflation now was due to, in particular, the rescue plan. So the last $2 trillion package that was put out in March of 2021, I worked on that package. I advised Congress. If you got your $1,400 stimulus checks, I get a little bit of a thank you there.
I was going to say thank you to Claudia.
Yeah, and in particular, I was firm and from my research that those needed to go to middle class families too. We really, COVID, surveys out of the Census Bureau showed that about half of US families lost some kind of income during COVID. Mm-hmm. And that's massive. I mean, our crisis was massive. And so it was very hard to know who needed help. I had some peers like Larry Summers, who was very against the rescue plan, still is, that said that in particular, much of the relief, like the stimulus checks, went beyond the imperative of need in 2021. And I felt very strongly that I'm not in a position to know who's in need, and he isn't either, mm-hmm. Right? So unlike after the Great Recession and the Obama administration, I truly believe, and I'm heartened to see that we did it, you swing for the fences, right? Go big for people. If you do too much, and we are dealing to some extent, it did contribute to some of the inflation. We got money to people that really needed it. We have an amazing labor market, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute.
Yes.
But when we look at inflation now, it is clear that we put a lot of money in people's hands, right? And small businesses. So yes, there was, and the economy reopened. Like, mm-hmm. Regardless if you got those stimulus checks, you've been sitting at home. And frankly, some of the rich people are the ones that can afford 3 vacations in 2 months. So there was, as the vaccine came out in the spring of 2021, the world really reopened. There was this massive pent-up demand, and people who normally wouldn't have money to go get in on that. And that was exactly the time that the supply chains, they didn't heal. It turns out customers can come back a lot faster than the stuff we want to buy. And frankly, customers came back faster than workers for a lot of different reasons. So if you have too much demand and not enough supply, you'll get inflation. Now, that's a pretty simple story. And while there's a narrative of greedflation, that big businesses are price gouging. I mean, we live in a shareholder capitalism economy. I'm not going to tell a corporation, do something that's not in your best interest. I mean, they're pretty straight up on what they are. Though I do think probably some businesses took some advantage. And we do have companies, particularly in the energy sector, that have what is referred to as extraordinary profits. Mm-hmm. And there is a case in times like that there's a very specific way to do it that doesn't discourage them from producing in the future that would tax those profits, but it'd be like a one-time thing. That's another example of something Congress could do, but I don't expect this to happen. Right. So we had inflation, and some of it is demand driven, but those pieces about the supply chains were broken. The workers couldn't come back. Remember, and in the summer, there was this, I was part of team transitory, inflation's coming down, these things, workers are coming back, things are reopening, schools are going to reopen. And in fact, inflation had started coming down in the summer into the fall. Then we got Delta. Then we got Omicron. We have gotten just multiple variants. We have millions of people that have long COVID. We lost 1 million Americans. Mm-hmm. And then Putin, right? So we have had repeated tragedies. And I often say, no, inflation was not transitory. We still have legit too high of inflation, particularly in many of the necessity goods. COVID wasn't transitory. Putin is not transitory. So, and this is important. It's not about, yeah, it's okay, I was team transitory. Like, I'm a good macro policy person. It's not about me, right? And I was a forecaster for 10 years. You can't do forecasts and get it right, but you have to try your hardest. And at the Federal Reserve, trying your hardest is you go to the data. You use the tools you have. You understand that in crises, particularly in a recession, the tools don't work so well.
Right.
Like,
I mean, the data is
crises all the time. And then one of the things that I was trained at the Fed is you tell the story, right? You have to have an intellectually consistent, I mean, I worked on what's called the judgmental forecast, right? You apply judgment from years, decades of working in that space. You still can be wrong. The Fed was absolutely wrong on their forecast of COVID. I mean, they were wrong on Putin. I think a lot of people would have been grateful if they'd gotten the Putin forecast right. Like, we could have done, and those things are real factors. And when there was a discussion about the rescue plan will cause inflation, none of the inflation hawks, none of the people that said don't send out the checks talked about Delta and Omicron. None of them talked about supply chains are so much more fragile than we thought. No one talked about there are a lot of workers that are sick or have caregiving. So it's important, if you are right for the wrong reason, then when people come back to you and say, what should we do next? You will give bad advice. Much of the advice coming from the inflation hawks is Fed, go, go, go. The Fed has the tools to cool off demand-driven inflation. Like, basically, they can make us all a little bit poorer, throw some people out of work, make it harder to borrow. They're not callous about it. This is their tool. If that were the only source of inflation, I would be more sympathetic to what the Fed is doing. They've done too much, but I'm sympathetic. But that's not, we have supply driven, and like something in housing, the Fed makes it worse. They're not going to be building more housing when interest rates and mortgage rates are just through the roof. So I think that's where there's a balance.
Right.
You know, and you have to address the problem that you actually have.